As the 1970s came to their close, there was less a sense of the final golden twilight or fin de siècle than one that we were looking at some kind of crepuscular gota d'Amarung, where in a hazy darkness a new order would emerge and sweep away the rapidly corrupting ancien regime. That didn't happen even as the old order left the stage and the bright new things came in. What did happen was that the inherently conservative industry absorbed as much change as it could bear and then remodeled it into, this time, a product which briefly captured the world's imagination and for 3 years or so put it up as a true peer in the early 1980s pop explosion. It was the little things that did it. As the local industry was unable to cope or was too ham-fisted in its attempts to cope with the dance explosion of 1977 to 79, disco died later in Australia than anywhere else, finally expiring in 1980. The crowds began to flock away from the inner city clubs and into the suburbs to pubs and taverns who'd realised that there was big money to be made in hosting live bands. For me, 1978 is a year of trying to bluff my way into pubs, though underage, to see the Angels, the Radiators, Mental as Anything, In Excess, The Church, who usually got booed off stage, Rose Tattoo, Cold Chisel, any number of bands who were honing themselves on a mazy circuit of suburban gigs and regional tours. Initially, these bands just worked on the basic, dry Albert sound, but as they graduated to recording, they found themselves working with, first as assistant producer and then as a full-blown producer, the man who apprenticed to take over from Vander and Young and Alberts, but managed to strike his own path too, Mark Opitz. And it was Opitz's fuller rock sound and sheen that he brought to his productions that began to define the sound of rock music in Australia through the early to mid-80s, before his talents began to see him find work primarily overseas. But it was unavoidable when listening to the radio between 1978 and 1983 not to hear his distinctive, muscular tone and the way bands seemed to thrive under it. Another incredibly significant event was David Bowie's tour in late 1978. His concert was the first to be held in our local football stadium with the Angels as his opening act. Our state minister for whatever he was minister for, a notoriously corrupt individual who had the good fortune to die just as the case before him was about to be brought down, proclaimed that there'd never be another open-air rock concert in Brisbane, such were the noise complaints. "Crikey, these pop singers come out here to make a quick quid by disturbing our peace and tranquility," said he. Someone must have passed the right person a brown paper bag of cash, because 2 years later, almost to the day, Kiss played the same stadium, albeit to just over half the people Bowie did. I was there. It was awesome. Anyway, what Bowie's tour did was raise the profile of and interest in new wave music. By the end of the 1970s, the Australian music scene was splitting and tribalising at a rate of knots. Gone was the ABC or AM radio's hegemony on pop music, as powerful FM stations began to crop up in 1980. In Brisbane, we were ahead of the curve, as 4ZZ, later Triple Z, has been broadcasting since 1975, and we've been hearing punk, new wave, jazz, whatever took the DJ's fancy. They even let me on it briefly. In 1986. Once. The then AM station 2JJ fired a meaningful shot across the bows of the establishment by playing the then band "You Just Like Me 'Cause I'm Good in Bed" by Skyhooks as its first ever record in January 1975. Double Z, Triple Z didn't go to air until December that year, and it only had at first a limited access transmitter covering the area around the University of Queensland. It was, however, soon upgraded to the point where I could faintly get a signal in the favela outside town that they called Woodridge. But suddenly we were hearing different music. At first prog and jazz, then hard rock and local bands, then punk and post-punk groups. There's a famous illustration of Triple Z's Hot 100 for 1975. The Hot 100 is the most popular songs with their then audience, which was topped by Good Vibrations and was almost 100% classic rock, and 1976, which is topped by Anarchy in the UK. It is 80% punk songs, which indicate how hard punk hit the local music scene. Not wishing to preempt a future video dedicated to my love-hate relationship with Triple Z, but the first local band to win that coveted #1 spot on the Hot 100 was the President's 11 in 1984. Now, it's widely believed that the poll was fixed that year, but just how it was done has forever remained a mystery, and I think in the interests of science and curiosity, somebody should come forward and tell us how they did it. Punk, however, never really took off in Australia. It was its late-to-the-party cousin New Wave, especially the keyboard, dance-oriented varieties, that eventually won out. While the Elvis Costello, Graham Parker influenced guitar bands held sway at first, and Graham Parker and the Rumour was the first overseas band my mates and I ever went to see in late 1978, they were spellbind. His opening act, The Sports, supply the title for this episode. Those enthralled to Bowie's gaunt, disassociated futurism won out, and it was that quirky approach allied to radio-friendly production which was the foundation of the so-called Australian invasion in the early 1980s. One other factor was the decline of Alberts, with their best hitmakers of the mid-70s, Stevie Wright, AC/DC, William Shakespeare, Ted Mulry, gone either to their own misadventures, the changing of fashions, or in the case of AC/DC, an all-or-nothing shot at making it in America. I say this because, family or not, AC/DC were on the tipping point with Alberts, having made a loss on every single release they'd ever made on the label because the cost of marketing them never overcame the value of their sales. It wasn't until Back in Black that they'd made their first dollar on them. Word was Albert would have to drop them. John Paul Young had had a very good 1978, being crowned King of Pop, but the progressive softening of his approach meant his days soon would be numbered. The Angels remained excellent value for the label, but they preferred working with Mark Opitz. And the Opitz muscle sound, along with the cleaner, more radio-friendly sound of the other super producer, Peter Dawkins, meant that the hyped-up bogan crunch of Vanda and Young was the sound of yesterday's heroes. So the elements for change were in place, but how did the local establishment react to their incorporation? Let's look at the performance of local acts on the charts in 1978, 79 and 98. In 1978 we had 12 songs in the end-of-year Top 100, 5 of which made the Top 40 and none the Top 10, plus another 8 from emigre Australians, Olivia Newton-John, the Bee Gees and Andy Gibb. Of them, only one-hit wonders Peaches with Substitute represented any kind of new blood. The rest were all well-established names, including some End with a Whisper, Not a Bang last gasps for Skyhooks and Sherbet. 1979, despite being a spectacular year for pop music in general, as the new wave began to enter the vocabulary of the day, only 4 local records ended up in the top 40, 2 of which were novelty songs, and 1 a TV theme, plus 8 others in the top 100 and 3 more from expats. Again, the Bee Gees and Olivia Newton-John. There's no disguising this is the worst return since 1973, and even considering the incredible competition local product was up against, it's disappointing that the local industry couldn't muster the firepower to even dent it. The closest we got was number 28, with another custom-built countdown confection in Christy Allen, with a song called Goosebumps. Allen, who came from the pop music backwater of Perth but was discovered by Terry Britton, soon to be songsmith to Tina Turner, Olivia Newton-John, Cliff Richard and Michael Jackson. The Cliff Richard connection is particularly obvious because Goosebumps is very reminiscent of Devil Woman, which Britton also co-wrote. Allen was pretty, she was a passable singer and by all accounts very easy to work with, and she filled the gap in the marketplace for a homegrown replacement for Olivia Newton-John. A family-friendly pop singer, although Goosebumps did rock pretty hard. who could shunt the current queen of Australian pop, the diva-ish Marsha Hines, quietly off the charts. Alan did that, scoring 4 hits in a year and a bit and winning the Best Female Performer award at the new Countdown Awards, which replaced the King and Queen of Pop in both 1979 and 1980. Alan toured extensively, especially in rural areas, but ill health put her career on hold for a long time. Mushroom Records boss Michael Gudinski so recognised her importance to the Australian music industry that he started a public campaign for information about how he could get in touch with her to sing at the Mushroom Records 25th anniversary concert in 1998 in front of just under 100,000 people in Melbourne. She almost stole the show, singing Goosebumps. I say almost because, face it, it is hard to top Kylie Minogue in a birthday cake, and retired from performing on that high note. One other significant development was that the biggest selling local album of the year was Breakfast at Sweethearts by Cole Chisel. Produced by Richard Batchen, who'd made some great music with Sherbet and had recently done Richard Clapton's Goodbye Tiger, one I should think of the 10 best Australian albums ever. Chisel fought tooth and nail to retain their rough and ready pub sound, while Batchens ran them through version after version in the studio, knocking the rough edges off but ensuring each member made their finest contribution. While the approach was successful, the album reaching number 4 in a year dominated by Supertramp, ELO and Kiss, they opted for the Opitz treatment for their next album, the mega hit East. 1980 was a productive and high-quality year for the locals. Just as the industry had rebounded in 1974 from the disappointments of 1973, 1980 saw a similar upswing following 1979's rather flat return. 6 songs made the end-of-year top 40, plus 2 expats, and all up 20 local records in the top 100. But best of all, for the first time since 1971, the number 1 single for the year was local, the magnificent, new wavy I Got You by Split Enz. Its attendant album, True Colours, spent 10 weeks at number 1 and was the 3rd best-selling album of the year, where Australian acts lodged 3 of the top 10 albums. Since I Got You, only 8 local records have ended the year at number 1, and 3 of them were pop talent show records, one of which, Shannon Knoll's cover of Moving Pictures' What About Me, is simply one of the most abominable records ever made. Interestingly, one of those top 10 records from 1980, a one-off novelty hit about space invaders, ended up being accidentally incredibly influential, as its bass line was commandeered by Jesse Saunders for what is generally considered to be the first house music record. In a year dominated by the next wave of chart acts, it was a surprise from this distance to see the likes of John, no longer Johnny, Farnham, and Colleen Hewitt have substantial hits, and Daryl Cotton of 60s legends The Zoot. Old 55 returned to the charts for the first time in many years with a fine cover of Two Faces of I. Christy Allen kept up her hit-making ways, and New Zealander Kim Hart had a great one-off with Love at First Night. Local band The Monitors had a couple of new wavy hits, the Ropies Singin' in the 80s, and the far superior but less well received Nobody Told Me. Most importantly, the year saw the arrival in force of the 6 groups that would dominate the first half of the 1980s. Split Enz, who made 4 further fantastic albums and another dozen hit singles, the less said about the 5th album they made, the better, in the decade, and gave us solid solo careers for Tim Finn and the mixed blessings of Crowded House. Australian Crawl, a band that could switch between sharp and cynical social observation and smooth top 40 pop rivaling the Little River Band, seamlessly and sensibly. The Angels, following up 1979's breakthrough Face to Face, ramped up the menace and ferocity on Darkroom. New Zealand's MySex, at one point touted as the future of local music, followed up their impressive debut album Graffiti Crimes with the Ultravox Tubeway Army-influenced Space Race, with singer Steve Gilpin becoming one of the most imposing figures on the local scene. MySex were also signed to a major label in CBS, so it makes their failure to translate to overseas markets even more puzzling. Flowers, later Icehouse, made a remarkable debut album which merges arty synthesizers and Berlin Bowieisms with bright pop melodies and managed to beat out In Excess to the Best Newcomers Awards at the Countdown Awards in 1980. Cold Chisel recorded what I think is their greatest work, East, although some prefer their previous album and many more their next one. Regardless of which was their best, East was the foundation which began to see Cold Chisel move away from the pubs and suburban venues and into being one of the most beloved institutions in Australian rock. Cold Chisel would reform periodically, have a #1 album, sell out venues with ease, and have shows which were inevitably a 2-hour sing-along, with vocalist Jimmy Barnes occasionally letting out a screech and generally strutting around like an avuncular uncle who'd had a bit too much to drink at Christmas time. Before we sum up, it would be only fair to mention Midnight Oil, a band I find genuinely abhorrent, who had released a moderately successful album and EP in 1979, but would not find genuine chart success until 1981, so they fall out of the scope of this episode, and no doubt I'll find some other excuse to ignore them later on. These were the last 3 years of my slavish devotion to the top 40, before the confronting sounds on 4ZZZ and my interest in 50s and 60s jazz and the discovery that Linton Kwesi Johnson was far more exciting than Bob Marley began to drag me aside. It's not to say that I abandoned top 40 at this point. I kept listening until about 1988, when it finally clicked to me after 3 years of declining enthusiasm with the radio that anything Ray Charles did in the 1950s was much, much better than everything anyone put on the radio in the late 1980s. Not that I miss much in the long run. Nowadays, thanks to the internet and a little disposable income, I can create the top 40 from any week in the last 50 years and run my own little oldies radio station. I can even take requests. Who listens to the radio? Indeed. As for the Australian music industry, it took the lessons it learned in building a distinctive Australian sound, or an Australian palette of sounds, which could create and sustain commercial success in foreign markets across multi-generations. Since 1980, we've seen probably 40 acts. All have remarkable success overseas based on the culture that was developed over trial and error through a turbulent decade when radio was king and I was its abject vassal. They are days that won't come again, but the lords of misrule govern music nowadays, so who is to say what these days ought to be? But think on the music you grew up with and celebrate it, because you can't know where it's at if you don't know where you've been. Oh, hey, so just a quick update. Since I released the video, I've been hiding here in the dark in what I call the conservatoire, but my wife less romantically calls the junk room, waiting for the inevitable appearance of Shannon Knoll at my front door, pounding on it and shrieking, "I'm Shannon Knoll, don't you know who I am? Let me in, I'm Shannon Knoll." It will happen.